What's up everybody, it's Ross. I know it's been a minute. Welcome back to another YouTube video. And today we're going to talk about 5 reasons why the New Testament writers were telling the truth. Let's get it. Number 1, early testimony. We have good reason to trust in and rely on the New Testament writers because their testimony was super early as the 1st century. Early enough to have included details about Jesus' life, teachings, crucifixion, resurrection that only eyewitnesses could have talked about. First, we have the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD. This was one of the most important and impactful events in all of Jewish history. However, nowhere is this mentioned by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or even Paul for that matter. So maybe you're thinking maybe this event actually did happen and the New Testament writers just left it out. It's possible, but this was something that Jesus predicted was going to happen earlier on, and they had no trouble writing about hundreds of other prophecies, so they had no reason to leave out this one. Second, the New Testament writers don't even mention the Roman siege of Jerusalem that occurred shortly after the destruction of the temple, giving us cause to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the Gospels were written very early. This was also a huge event that nobody would have hesitated in mentioning. Last but not least, the New Testament writers don't mention the gruesome deaths of Peter, Paul, and even James. Paul was beheaded in Rome in 64 AD for his faith. Peter was crucified upside down in 65 AD, and James was beheaded in Jerusalem in 62 AD. These are things that would have helped demonstrate the veracity and legitimacy of the Christian faith. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had no reason to leave them out. Considering this, we have good reason to believe that the Gospels were written sometime between 40 and 70 AD. Number 2, external corroboration. You might be able to say that the Bible itself is not evidence. But we have 10 non-Christian, extra-biblical ancient sources within a decade of Jesus' crucifixion. We have a whole plethora of Jewish, Greek, Syrian, and even Roman historians including Josephus, Tacitus, Phlegon, Suetonius, the Jewish Talmud, amongst others who affirm the existence of Jesus, his teachings, his miracles, his crucifixion, and the claims of the eyewitness testimony of his resurrection. Just a few things about eyewitness testimony of the Gospels before we really get into it. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all include different perspectives and different details about the story of Jesus' life. However, they are all 100% consistent about the impact events, these being the teachings, miracles, crucifixion, resurrection, and even the reappearances of Jesus Christ. These are not contradictory, but rather confirm that they are reliable, trustworthy, and consistent accounts. Why, you ask? Suppose you, I, and another person witness a car crash. People get injured, ambulances show up, and the police ask us to give an account of what we saw to file a report. I might report the color of one car. You might report the name of the street where the cars collided. The other person might have noticed the model of the car, but we are all consistent in the fact that we know that a car crash happened. Varying details are always to be expected in eyewitness accounts. Now, picture this. Suppose you're a detective at the scene of a crime. You know that there were 3 eyewitnesses that saw everything go down. You separate them immediately. You take them back to the police station and you interrogate them individually. They tell you all the exact same thing, not varying in detail one bit. Every single detail they tell you is exactly the same. Kind of suspicious, right? Sounds like what? Maybe they got together beforehand and came up with one big lie. How did they report everything they saw in the exact same way? Let's take a real world example. When the Titanic sank, several of the most well-known newspapers all had different accounts regarding the number of people lost and the number of survivors, as well as several other varying facts. Are these things contradictory? What do we know from these headlines? We know what the impact event was, that the Titanic sank. The same can be concluded about the resurrection and reappearance of Jesus Christ, which would be considered to be one of the most, if not the most, impactful event in the history of the world, something that no one would forget. Now, let's get into the real eyewitness testimony. First, we have the 2 women of the tomb, Mary and Mary Magdalene, who were the first to see the risen Jesus in all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, think about this for a second. If the gospel writers were lying or making up some kind of a story, they wouldn't have used women as the first eyewitness accounts of such a historical event. Considering the cultural context at the time, a woman's testimony wasn't the same as that of a man's and wouldn't have been listened to or even taken into consideration. The only reason to believe that the New Testament writers included women as the first eyewitness accounts of the risen Jesus is because it actually happened. Next, we have the transformation of the Apostle Paul. Paul, originally named Saul, was actually a Christian persecutor and killer at the time. He was on his way to Damascus, modern-day Syria, when he apparently saw the risen Jesus Christ. Because of such an impactful event, Paul became a Christian upon witnessing this, never denied his faith, and was killed by the Romans because of it, and ended up being one of the most prominent ambassadors of the Christian faith, writing the books of Romans, Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, and even Thessalonians. Next, we have James. James was the half-brother of Jesus and was actually skeptical of him being the Messiah during Jesus' entire ministry and did not really believe in him. However, James and even the rest of Jesus' family, because he actually did have other brothers and sisters who doubted him, converted to Christianity when seeing the risen Jesus Christ. Believe it or not, James was actually the first one to start the first Christian church in Jerusalem shortly after the resurrection. James never took back his faith and was actually beheaded with a sword around 44 AD. Last but not least, we have 500 eyewitnesses mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15 and another 120 eyewitnesses mentioned in Acts 1:15. It is also reported in the book of Acts that even some of Jesus' enemies, some of the Jewish priests and Pharisees, the ones who actually crucified him, started believing and converting to Christianity. So, as we have seen in the last few minutes, Jesus did not only show up once, but many times. He did not only appear to one person, but to many people. He did not only appear to individuals, but to large groups. He did not only appear in one place, but many places. And he did not only appear to his disciples and followers, but even non-believers. Number 4, embedded confirmation. What do I mean by embedded confirmation? What I mean is that all the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all fit together like puzzle pieces. Differing details are to be expected from eyewitness testimony, but they are all consistent in regards to Jesus' teachings, claims of being God, crucifixion, and even his resurrection. Where one gospel recounts an event and seems to have left out key information, another gospel fills in the gap. Let me give you a few examples. In the book of Matthew, Peter and Andrew, who were not yet disciples of Jesus, had been fishing all day and hadn't caught one thing. Peter and Andrew were actually approached by Jesus and told to drop everything they were doing and everything they had and follow him. Without any detail or explanation at all, that's exactly what they did. We're kind of left in the dark here about why they did this. It just doesn't make any sense and seems kind of incomplete. However, in the book of Luke, we get a recount of the same story. In this version, we actually get the complete picture, and it kind of fills in the gaps as to what we were missing. We see that Peter and Andrew had been fishing all day and hadn't caught anything. Jesus comes along and tells them to lower their nets into the water one more time. They do so, pull up their nets, and find their nets absolutely bursting full of fish. Luke tells us that even their boat started sinking because they had caught so many fish. This information in Luke serves as a puzzle piece, filling in the gap that was left in the book of Matthew as to why these two men dropped everything and decided to follow Jesus Christ. Another example is the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus multiplies the bread and the fish. In the book of Mark, it mentions that crowds of people were in the area at the time, but it doesn't exactly explain why they were there. If we go to the book of John, we see that the reason for this is because it was the Jewish Passover, a Jewish holiday, and also because people had heard that Jesus was performing many miracles at the time. We also see here that it specifically mentions the disciples Andrew and Philip. This seems strange because these two disciples, Andrew and Philip, are rarely ever mentioned throughout the whole New Testament. We are left wondering why. But here we have yet another puzzle piece that fills in the gap. If we go to the Gospel of Luke, we see that the feeding of the 5,000 people occurs in a place called Bethsaida. We also see that Jesus asks these two disciples where to get bread and to get fish to feed all the people. The question here is, why would Jesus ask these two disciples in particular? The answer to this puzzle piece actually comes later in the book of Luke, where he mentions that Andrew and Philip are actually from Bethsaida and know the place well. It now makes total sense why Jesus would ask them where to get bread and where to get fish, and why these two specific disciples are mentioned in this story. Lastly, we have an account in the book of Matthew, chapter 26, in which Jesus is brought before Caiaphas, Jewish priests, and even Roman soldiers. Jesus is slapped and beaten as punishment for claiming to be God. There is a particular piece of dialogue in this story in which the Jewish priests say to Jesus, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who slapped you?" This leaves us kind of puzzled in this situation. Why would they ask Jesus to tell them who hit him if they were standing right in front of him and he knew exactly who did it? This is clearly a missing piece to the puzzle. The good news is, yet again, another gospel writer helps fill in the gaps. Luke, in chapter 22, tells the same series of events, but mentions that Jesus was actually blindfolded during this whole thing. Now, the question that the Jewish priests asked Jesus while taunting him makes total sense. And finally, number 5, excruciating testimony. The last, but obviously not the least important reason in regards to why we can trust the New Testament writers is because the disciples stood firm in their faith through excruciating circumstances. The disciples who claimed to have seen the resurrected Jesus and became Christians were kicked out of the synagogue, persecuted constantly, tortured brutally, and even put to death. All the evidence that we have today points to the fact that they never recanted their faith, stood firm in it to the end, and were willing to die because of it. Let's look at some excruciating examples. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. Andrew was crucified in Greece. Bartholomew was whipped to death in Armenia. James was beaten to death in Jerusalem. John died in exile at the prison mines on the island of Patmos. Luke was hanged in Greece. Mark was dragged by a horse till death in Alexandria, Egypt. Matthew died with a sword in Ethiopia. Matthias was stoned and beheaded in Jerusalem. Thomas was stabbed to death with a spear in India. Did they endure all this for a lie? I don't think so. You might say, well, modern day Muslims die all the time for what they believe to be true. While it's reasonable to believe you and I might die for something we mistakenly think to be true, it's completely unreasonable to believe that the original eyewitnesses died for what they definitely knew to be a lie. Considering the fact that all these disciples were willing to endure persecution, torture, death, they stood firm in their faith, and they never took it back, gives us cause to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that what they died for is true. Well, that does it, everybody. There are 5 reasons as to why we can believe that the New Testament writers were telling the truth. I hope you liked this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next one. God bless.